One of the things that, and this is kind of related, is there's a peculiar way in which environmental regulation enforcement takes place in a devolved administration rather than elsewhere. And you've been representing the department and advising them. What's your sense of the peculiar differences between a devolved administration and a non-devolved administration?
Well, I mean, it's a very complex, a lot of complex dimensions to that, but I suppose if you are a sovereign state, if you're working in Dublin, you are, I suppose, environmental law is a highly Europeanized subject, and something like 90% of the legislation that comes, that operates in the sphere of the environment, comes from Europe. So I suppose if you're not in a devolved scenario, the policy on the environment is set by the central administration, and it has much more control in terms of, Ireland is representing itself in its relations with the EU and in terms of the development of EU environmental law. Whereas at a policy level, the devolved administration in Northern Ireland has to go through the gatekeeping role that London occupies. London controls the discussion with Europe. And in a sense, Northern Ireland has to try and influence London to make sure that when London is negotiating the UK's position on environmental directives, that the devolved position is properly taken account of. And I suppose the problem, I think, in the environmental sphere is that while it made on one level sense to devolve the responsibility across to Northern Ireland for environment, it's a very, very complex portfolio. And some people would say, but surely it's simply a matter of copying out what's done in London, why is it so difficult? But it's actually, when I went into work as a civil servant, I began to realise just how different the economic base is here, and there can often be very significant environmental differences. So it can be quite a big challenge for a small jurisdiction like Northern Ireland to, with a relatively limited policy capacity, to influence a very, very complex and fast-moving legislative and policy debate. But in terms of then once the legislation is put in place, the other big challenge for devolution or for devolved administrations is that under our devolution arrangement, we have responsibility for developing the implementing legislation for the directives and for practical delivery for regulation itself. And while that gives the administration a certain freedom to try and find its certain sort of flexibility in trying to find its own solutions here, if there is a failure in Northern Ireland, the devolved administrations, both Scotland and Northern Ireland, must pay any fines that are levied on the UK for non-compliance at European level. Now, the difficulty with that is that if the European Commission takes a case against the UK for non-compliance, and if a fine is imposed, the fine is levied at a UK level. So it's the UK's GDP and the UK's voting weight that's taken into account by the European Court in setting the fine. But the fine is notionally transferred to the responsible administration. And that has put a huge pressure on, in a sense, there's been a big transfer of responsibility, but not necessarily, I would say, an equal transfer of influence, because it is difficult for Northern Ireland to influence thinking in London. And I suppose also our environment is inherently connected to the southern environment. And often what Northern Ireland wants is to necessarily, especially in the environmental sphere and the agricultural, the related spheres, that Northern Ireland's often their best solutions are allied to the two Irish governments implementing a kind of a common strategy. So strangely, devolution has created a very, very complex, if you like, policy context on the environment for Northern Ireland, because they need to work with the southern government and they need to work with the Great Britain governments, with London and often with Scotland. So for a very small administration, there are very complex questions to deal with, and we're the only part of the UK with an international border, which produces its own regulatory complications in terms of creating loopholes and unexpected outcomes. So devolution is actually a very complex issue for Northern Ireland, and I think in a sense the new ministers, or it's still relatively new, are really only getting to grips with the implications of European membership.
One of the, certainly one of the assumptions, and probably it's accurate, is that the EU has been driving a number of countries to advance their environmental protection efforts. Certainly the Republic of Ireland, that's a major issue, and without the EU it would have been much more backward. Do you think there's any parallel development in terms of the UK being able to pressure the Northern Ireland to move forward more on protection?
Well, undoubtedly, the UK, when Northern Ireland was in the thick of numerous infractions back in the early part of the devolution experience in '98 and the early 2000, 2002, London certainly made it clear that they expected Northern Ireland to deliver, that they expected the government here to improve compliance records and to protect the UK from having a fine. And that was put to the Northern Ireland government in no uncertain terms, and it did have a very powerful policy impact. That, if you like, the pincer movement of both London saying we will transfer the fine and Europe saying we will fine you had a huge impact. But in areas, for example, like the Climate Change Act, which is in essentially a homegrown piece of legislation to the UK, it's much more difficult for London to sanction Northern Ireland when Northern Ireland decides, even though they are bound by the Act, that they are going to take an extremely de minimis position on the whole issue of climate change. And one of the pieces of research that I'm working on myself at the moment is to try and quantify, to try and understand legally as well as politically the nature of that relationship. That on one level, I think London has made a decision to give Northern Ireland a lot of latitude, that we've much more devolved power here over energy than they would have in Scotland. So there's a much greater amount of freedom in terms of deciding how they're going to meet the Climate Change Act and, if you like, navigating the future of energy policy. But at the same time, there is very little sense to my mind of limits on that freedom. And I think that we, for example, had our draft Sustainable Development Strategy published before Christmas, which was extremely weak. And one has to wonder, is London simply saying to itself, we have set a sort of a macro target for the country, but if Northern Ireland doesn't deliver, is there going to be any real consequence? And I think that is one of the unanswered questions about that side of the devolution relationship. I think in a sense London's hope is that Northern Ireland will see this as a priority and see the importance of attending to these policy areas, but I suppose people working and living locally feel that in terms of trying to see how, when Northern Ireland's Environment Minister at the time, Sammy Wilson, attracted national headlines in his position on climate change, it wasn't obvious to me that there was any means of preventing or controlling that position, even though it was completely contradictory to the national government's position on climate change.
Yeah, I mean, that's, and you said it's an unanswered question, but I'm going to ask you to answer it, okay, at this point. The Copenhagen meeting of the Conference of the Parties under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change was by almost all accounts a disaster, a weak result, if any result. What was your sense of where we go from here on that, dealing with climate change in Northern Ireland?
Well, I think at an international level, I think it became clear in the weeks leading up to Copenhagen that they weren't going to have a legal framework, much less a political framework, as it ultimately turned out. But I suppose the danger is that they have lost so much momentum at an international level that in fact the international mitigation effort is now in a state of tremendous flux. But I think because of that loss of momentum, I think the whole question of adaptation is going to considerably rise up through the political priority. That in a sense there is now an even greater danger that they're not going to keep climate change below dangerous levels or below the levels the IPCC are recommending, and therefore adaptation is going to become a much more serious challenge. And I think for an island society, north and south, sitting on the coast of the Atlantic, whose energy sources are almost entirely fossil fuel based, we're at the end of a very long pipeline and an increasingly insecure energy pipeline. The question of energy insecurity and carbon management are extremely serious for this island. And I think that as we are forced into an adaptation era, flood management, uncertain weather, fluctuating energy prices are going to become very, very serious questions, and regulation will have to respond